If you have a presidential candidate or a major politician on your show and you do not fuck with them in any way, you're a podcaster. You're not a comedian. I may have gone on Rogan before just to have the conversation. I don't think I would now. I saw someone online ask, am I upset that Adam Ray as Dr. Phil, talking to Dr. Phil, is going to be a Netflix special the week before Bones and All comes out, as if I would ever feel threatened by that.
No.
So for the past couple of years, Anthony Jeselnik has been taking shots at the Rogansphere or Rogansphere comedians on his podcast here and there. But now that he's back after a few months of not posting episodes, it does seem like he's been a lot more honest and open with how he feels about those Rogansphere comedians. For example, on his last episode, he was being a lot more aggressive with his criticism towards those comics and even Joe Rogan himself, which is pretty wild. And although he didn't technically name drop anybody, he didn't mention Joe or any of the other comedians, to me, it was pretty clear who he was talking about. So in this video, we'll take a look at some of those comments, some of the recent comments, and also some of the things he has said in the past to try and figure out if he does have a point or if we disagree, because he actually went as far as to say that some of those podcast comedians are not real comics, they're not really comedians, and instead they're just podcasters, which is pretty wild, but we have said that in the past. So let's get started.
You did great. A lot of pre-rolls. I'm glad I don't have to do it. Apologies for being off for so long. I feel like we could have changed the outcome of the election if we had been here. I know a lot of podcasters got involved. Notice I said podcasters. I did not say comedians. A lot of podcasters got involved. Look, if you have a presidential candidate or a major politician on your show and you do not fuck with them in any way, you're a podcaster. You're not a comedian. If you cancel an entire weekend of shows at the very last second so you can run yourself to Washington, D.C. to interview a vice presidential candidate and then post a picture of your arms around each other, you're not a comedian. We put out offers.
Yeah.
We put out offers. We told Kamala, we said, come into the Burbank studio, the old Burbank studio. We'll give you 20 minutes, talk about whatever you want. Never heard back. We told Elon Musk, we'll do a Zoom call, 25 minutes. We'll ask you questions about the Tesla truck. Everybody wants to know. We talked to Trump, Greg and I, for an hour in here, and then Aaron forgot to hit record.
My bad, guys.
Now, this one is a little bit tricky because obviously from Anthony's perspective, it sounds like he does believe that if you are a comedian that has a comedy podcast and you have the opportunity to talk to a major politician or a presidential candidate and you don't mess with them in a major way or troll them, then you're not really a comedian. And I guess he does have a point to an extent. Obviously, to be fair, when it comes to Joe Rogan, I don't think that applies. I don't think he was talking about him. Simply because even though on paper, technically, Joe Rogan has always been a comedian, his podcast was never a comedy podcast. And instead, it was just a platform where he could talk to anybody about anything. And so, again, I don't think that applies to him. And I think we can also add Theo Von to that list, in my opinion. We've mentioned this in the past, but he is one of the few comedians that has been doing it correctly. And also his platform, or his podcast, very similar to Joe Rogan, has been built around Theo Von having conversations with anybody about anything. And it's not, his brand is not being edgy or, being a gotcha podcast or making the guests uncomfortable or anything like that. Now, when it comes to the rest of the Rogansphere, it's pretty safe. I think it's pretty safe to assume that he was talking about Tim Dillon or Andrew Schultz.
And listen, if you're making $200 million a year, who do you work for? That's what I'd love to know. Who do you work for once you have you money? Because you work for someone. And I think it's weird. And it's not comedian-like. There's podcasters, there are comedians, and I don't think they're mixing anymore. I think you're one or the other. I think you're one or the other. I think I've got some press lined up. I've got the Vulture piece coming out. I've got a couple of podcasts I'm going to do. I'm doing Marin next week. I'm going to do Tom Papa's podcast this week, and then very few others. I think an article for Cracked I'm going to do, but I've turned down a lot. Bad Friends, I love you guys. I don't want to deal with your bullshit. I might go on Bill Simmons. We'll see if Bill Simmons ever gets back to me this time. We have the same publicist, so it should happen, but we'll see. I don't have a lot of faith. But then I think once the special comes out, I think I'm going to get a lot more requests. We'll see. We'll see what happens. We'll see what I want to go on. I may have gone on Rogan before just to have the conversation. I don't think I would now.
And it does make sense because you could argue that given the massive opportunity, neither of them did anything funny or that creative. For example, I don't know if this would be a good idea, but wouldn't it be different or a little bit funny to have a politician or even Trump start the Flagrant podcast with one of those monologues the same way Logan Paul did back then? Or when it comes to Tim Dillon, maybe do a sketch. I don't know, maybe that's asking way too much. And at the end of the day, their podcast episodes were massively successful. But if the only goal is to get views and money and more exposure and not really to be funny, then at that point, the comedy podcasts are not that much better than a Full Send podcast episode, which, you know, you could argue they were the ones that started this whole trend and have also had some funny moments here and there. So, you know, not the best look in my opinion.
This is what happens when I don't do a ton of spots. I'm usually out on the road doing my own shows, headlining, and those are the shows that I show up to and are good. And I try to do the other ones, but sometimes there's a problem. I was on the way to a spot and I tripped and fell into a sushi restaurant for 3 hours. And it happens because of the violence on the streets. You know, doing spots is something I've done for 12 years. It's not as fun anymore doing them. It's not as fun anymore to have to make small talk with Anthony Jeselnik, who shared an article saying that comedy had an alt-right problem that the New Republic decided to publish. Anthony Jeselnik, who made his bones doing Boston Marathon bombing jokes, has now decided he's the arbiter of what is and isn't appropriate to be said on stage.
And I thought this was very funny. And I don't know, maybe he goes on later on in the podcast and comes back at me, but I just thought it was so funny for someone to be polite and nice and have ample opportunity to say anything to me that he wanted. Like, the small talk was like, how's the crowd? Like, all these outdoor shows are weird, huh? Like, very simple, like, I'm being polite because I don't know you and we're in a room together, like just the two of us or like one other person, that it would be awkward if I said nothing. But I don't know, like, Greg, back me up on this. Like, I'm not Johnny Smalltalk.
And funny enough, most people were speculating that he was taking shots at Tim Dillon right away, even commenting that on that under his YouTube video for that podcast episode. And although what he said could apply to a lot of other comedians, even outside of the Rogansphere, what made it very clear or gave us a big hint that he was talking about Tim Dillon was his comments about how if you cancel a comedy show last minute to do a podcast episode, then you're not a real comedian. Because I was looking around and it turns out that on the Tim Dillon subreddits, a few people were complaining or posting how Tim Dillon canceled a show last minute. And if you take a look at the dates, they do line up with when Tim Dillon uploaded his podcast episode with JD Vance, if I remember correctly. Now, when it comes to comedians having to cancel comedy shows to go record a podcast episode, that's another tricky one because my gut feeling tells me that it's not right. You know, there are people that planned ahead. They hired a nanny. They made plans for a weekend and now pretty much have to throw that away and reschedule. But also, because nowadays podcast comedians like Tim Dillon, because they have such a large portion of their audience that comes from the podcast, I don't know if they would care as much as long as they have a good podcast episode coming out and a chance to reschedule, as opposed to, let's say, a comedian that just cancels for whatever reason. And by the way, don't forget to like the video. It helps out so much and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And again, the state of podcasting, I'm disgusted with. I don't want to be a part of this. Even when I know our podcast is different, but even when I say that, I feel stupid. Like, I don't like being a podcaster. I don't like that in my bio, like JRVP is the first thing that comes up, because while I'm writing the next hour, this would be the thing we're still doing. And this is the thing. And listen, it's been profitable. We've been doing great. 250 episodes is probably enough. We probably could have ended it around 220, and I would have been a whole happy thing. The last 30 episodes, I've been furious. But listen, everything is on the table.
But you're not furious. You were just furious, like, because you're on tour and you're jamming this in between.
Yes, but it's become repetitive. I've gotten sick of it. 250 is a lot. It's got nothing to do with you. It's got nothing to do with All Things Comedy, who I love. I love both you guys. I just met the new...
Equally?
However, the main question is, would a comedian like Louis C.K., Dave Chappelle, or Bill Burr, do you think they would cancel a comedy show just to go talk to a politician and potentially have a viral podcast episode? I mean, I don't know, but I don't think so. And again, when it comes to Joe Rogan, it is impressive the fact that it all happened in his podcast studio, which again shows you the massive difference and the gap between Joe Rogan and pretty much everybody else, because it was the same thing for both sides. Everyone that had a podcast episode with a politician had to travel and pretty much build a whole set to be able to record. But with Joe Rogan, it all happened in his own territory, which is insane.
I've always had this opinion. I've always believed that it's total bullshit. Comedy should be a little dangerous, and if there's no consequences, then it's not dangerous at all. So do your job. Be better. Joey Swole. And that was... Did we get any notes? I could shit on cancel culture pussies all day.
It's just boring. That's the thing. It's not that funny, and it's boring. So if you're a comedian, to talk about it a lot is kind of boring.
It's boring
and unfunny.
And it's marketing. It's like, hey, like my special was so extreme that the streaming services wouldn't take it without me editing out my favorite bits. So I'm going to put it on this site where you've got to pay for it. And if you guys don't pay $20 for this special, then I guess my career's over and the woke mob won. That's marketing. Do what you got to do to sell your special. That's great. It is 100% marketing. None of that stuff actually happened. In the NFL, here's the metaphor I like to use. In the NFL, every single year, before the season starts, they change the rules a little bit. They changed the rules to help the offensive players. You can't hit the quarterback. You can't make contact with the receiver. You can't tackle him in this way. And the defensive players get mad. And they complain for a week. They're like, this sucks. Why don't they just put a dress on the guy? This is going to be tough. And then the first game of the season, you have no excuses. You go and play the game. You can't miss a tackle and say, well, these rules, no one gives a shit. They only care about the score. Football players all shut up when the season starts and they play the game with the new rules.
Now, to be fair, when it comes to Anthony Jeselnik, he has gotten a lot of criticism in the past for doing what he does, calling out other comedians. And if I remember correctly, he even took shots at Shane Gillis and also Legion of Skanks at some point in the past. And so because of that, a lot of people have labeled him as jealous, as him being jealous, and that being the reason why he does what he does. But I think it's a lot deeper than just simply being jealous. For example, if you take a look at those clips, he has been taking shots and calling out the Rogansphere comedians for years now, and not just focusing on who's the bigger one at the moment. But also, I think it is important to point out that comedians like Anthony came up in a very similar way as Louis C.K., meaning that they started writing for late night comedy shows and then eventually started performing stand-up comedy themselves. And so because he did come up through a more quote-unquote traditional way, it does make sense why he has strong feelings when it comes to stand-up comedy as an art form, as cringe as that sounds.
But I can give you a spoiler. I took the word podcaster out of my bio when it came time to promote the special. I've been doing a lot of press. The new hour, I would say that the way comedy is right now, I have a chip on my shoulder, and I'd like to utilize that chip. I want to put it on in green and then spin that wheel. That's my gambling metaphor. I don't really know. Once the special comes out, I will be able to relax. I love the tour so much. I hope that the special is a representation of how much I love the tour. I've watched it several times. I cannot watch it again, but I'm excited for November 26th when people get to see it. I'm very, very excited for that. Europe was amazing.
We have been saying this for a while, but I do think there needs to be a different label or a name for podcast comedians, social media comedians, and Rogansphere comedians, because although yes, they're selling out massive venues and have comedy specials, because of social media and Joe Rogan, it's one of those cases of the chicken or the egg, because are they successful and famous because their comedy is that good, Or do people think their comedy is good because of how famous and successful they are? For example, I wonder if Joe Rogan's new fan base knows the whole situation that happened with Brendan Schaub, because Joe Rogan essentially gave Brendan a massively successful stand-up comedy career by telling his whole fan base how funny he was and how Brendan was a good person behind the scenes. And so that is perfect proof that the Rogansphere effect is a very real thing.
There was a comic who just kept giving me advice. This is like a couple months ago. Just kept being like, oh, you should do this as a podcast. You should do this. And I'm like trying to be polite for as long as I can. And finally, I'm like, if I need any more career advice, I'll let you know. And the room laughed, and the guy was like, oh, yeah, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. And everyone was like, that was really funny. I'm like, I wasn't trying to be mean, but he like didn't give me any choice.
Yeah.
I saw him and Anthony Jeselnik talk before a show one time in the green room. And he had referenced a time before when he was like trying to like give Anthony Jeselnik advice, and it was in front of other people, and he kind of framed it as like, oh yeah, Anthony snapped at me, but I'm like, well yeah, you were trying to like, he's one of the greatest living comics, dude. You know what I mean? Like his specials crush, like, and he's also like, he's kind of got this mystique where like, he doesn't even need to use Instagram or social media. It's just like, you know, like when Anthony Jeselnik drops a special, like I'm watching it, you know, and I've seen him perform enough times where like, he's just, you obviously know it's like, he's all about comedy and doesn't give a, and Brendan tried to say, he's like, oh yeah, well you should try to like this. And like, he was kind of giving him like, because Brendan in his mind is like, oh, well I'm like a business and marketing guy, so I'm trying to give Anthony Jeselnik advice. But he made it seem like he's like, Anthony's talking this way. And it's kind of like, hey Brendan, I think I got it. Like he like gives him like, he says that and like winks at him. I'm like, that was Anthony Jeselnik's way of being like, hey, you don't ever talk to me about anything relating my career again.
And once again, I think it is important to include those clips from way back then, because even though I don't agree with everything that Anthony said, at the very least, it does show you that he doesn't really care about the marketing or the clout chasing side of things of the comedy business. Because, for example, he's only been on Joe Rogan's podcast once, and that was 5 years ago. And as we all know, there is no marketing strategy or no plan that beats being best friends with Joe Rogan and being on the podcast 90 plus times. And that is what, you know, when it comes to Brendan Schaub, that is what he completely missed out on when talking to Anthony. And that is the exact same thing that happens to all the Rogansphere comedians. Again, it's not simply that they're just friends with Joe Rogan, it's that they completely forget and become delusional to how they became successful. For example, again, with Brendan Schaub, he completely forgot that he had been on the podcast 90 plus times and was trying to give another comedian advice that clearly wouldn't apply to them because they've only been on the podcast once.
I don't know if Adam Ray enjoyed having me on the show. And again, it didn't hurt our friendship, but and maybe it's evolved and now it's a little more silly. Before it just seemed like he gets to do all the silly stuff, and then I'm like answering questions about how far comedy can go, and I'm like, I don't like this vibe here. But again, I think it's my fault. So yeah, I'm on it. I think there's one clip they got out of it that I look furious in when I'm making fun of him, but I did not enjoy it, but through no fault of Adam Ray. I saw someone online ask, am I upset that Adam Ray as Dr. Phil, talking to Dr. Phil, is going to be a Netflix special the week before Bones and All comes out? As if I would ever feel threatened by that. No. As if that would not be, like there's no special that would come out around the same time as mine that I would feel like was taking away, except maybe a Chappelle or a Bill Burr or a John Mulaney. Any of like the big Chris Rock, I bet keep those guys away from me. Let me have my moment. I've got my moment. All right. You can watch Adam Ray's special and then sit down and think about that shit for a week before my shit drops. All right. I'm not worried about that thing competing with me at all.
And also, since now technically cancel culture is completely done, I wonder what their new angle will be or what the excuse will be for not putting out great comedy, because we mentioned this back when we reviewed Andrew Schultz's new material when I saw him live, and it was so shocking. The main takeaway was how shocking it was that back then, a few years back, when cancel culture was at its peak and going after everyone, he was actively trying to be as edgy as possible and not not following the rules. But now that the rules have changed, he did a complete 180, and now his new comedy, his new material is, is very family friendly compared to what he used to do in the past. And when it comes to Tim, I know he put out a Netflix comedy special, but I don't think he's put out an actual stand-up comedy special recently. So it will be interesting to see what the Rogansphere comedians put out in terms of stand-up comedy in the next few years. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. Dislike if you didn't like the video. But that is all we have for today. See ya.